The hum of fluorescent lights filled the grocery store, blending with the occasional squeak of shopping cart wheels. The place was as ordinary as her life had become, yet it was where she spent most Thursday afternoons. Margaret, 54, moved through the aisles with a practiced efficiency, her list folded neatly in her hand. Her life was predictable, perhaps too much so. Widowed for over a decade, her days had settled into a rhythm of work, home, and the occasional calls from her grown children. She didn't mind the solitude most of the time. It was comfortable, unchallenging, and safe. Margaret was reaching for a jar of marinara sauce on a high shelf when a voice interrupted her. "Need some help with that?" She turned to see a man, his early 30s at most, tall with an easy smile. His brown hair was slightly tousled, and he carried an air of casual confidence. He reached for the jar and handed it to her before she could respond. "Oh, thank you," she said, a bit flustered. "Anytime," he replied, his smile widening. "I'm always happy to be of service in the sauce aisle." She chuckled despite herself. "Quite the specialty you've chosen. It's a competitive market," he said with a wink before moving on. Margaret watched him for a moment, a small smile lingering on her face. She couldn't remember the last time a stranger had spoken to her so warmly or made her laugh. She shook off the thought, attributing her reaction to nothing more than the novelty of the moment. But as she continued shopping, she found herself glancing down the aisles, half hoping to run into him again. And when she spotted him at the checkout, their eyes met, and he offered a small wave. She left the store that day feeling something she hadn't in years, a flicker of light in her otherwise predictable life. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that maybe, just maybe, there were still surprises waiting for her in the world. The following Thursday, Margaret found herself in the same grocery store, her list in hand. She told herself it was just another errand, but her heart carried a subtle anticipation she couldn't quite explain. She was comparing brands of olive oil when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Careful. That one's overpriced." Margaret turned to find him again, the same easy smile playing on his face. He gestured to a bottle on the lower shelf. "This one's better and half the price," he said. "You're quite the grocery store expert," she replied, smiling despite herself. "I spend a lot of time here," he admitted. "Cooking's a hobby of mine." That sparked a conversation. His name was Eric, and he lived a few blocks away. He was a freelance graphic designer, which, he explained, gave him plenty of time to experiment in the kitchen. Margaret shared her own limited culinary adventures, laughing at her attempts to replicate recipes her late husband had once loved. Before she knew it, they were strolling through the aisles together, chatting about everything from the best spices for pasta to their favorite childhood meals. It was easy, natural, as if they'd known each other for much longer than a few minutes. When they reached the checkout, he surprised her again. "I'll see you around," he said with a small wave. "Same time next week." Margaret left the store with a warmth in her chest, clutching her groceries and a newfound sense of excitement. Over the next few weeks, their grocery store meetings became a routine. It wasn't planned, at least not explicitly, but they both seemed to find their way there on Thursday afternoons. Each interaction brought a little more ease, a little more familiarity. They shared recipes, laughed over stories, and even debated over the merits of frozen vegetables versus fresh. Eric's enthusiasm was infectious, and Margaret found herself looking forward to these moments more than she cared to admit. For years, her life had been marked by sameness, but now there was something different. A small, undeniable joy brought by an unexpected friendship. One Thursday, after they talked for what felt like hours about the best ways to make homemade bread, Eric turned to her with an easy grin. "You know, Margaret, you're the only person I've met who seems to enjoy grocery shopping as much as I do." She laughed, the sound startling her for its genuineness. "I wouldn't go that far. I think it's the company that makes it enjoyable." The words slipped out before she had time to catch them, and she felt a warmth creep into her cheeks. Eric didn't seem to notice. He was busy picking up a box of flour, reading the label like it was the most important thing in the world. But Margaret noticed. She noticed everything. The way his hair fell messily across his forehead, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he spoke about the simplest things with such energy that it made her feel alive again. That evening, as she unpacked her groceries, Margaret found herself thinking about him. Not just his kindness or his humor, but him, Eric. His presence, his voice, The way he made her feel seen and valued in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her thoughts startled her. She was in her 50s, a widow who'd long since put away the idea of romantic entanglements. Eric was young, vibrant, and full of a life she sometimes felt she'd already lived. What could he possibly see in her beyond a friendly face at the grocery store? Yet, as the days passed, she couldn't shake the flutter in her chest when she thought of him. She told herself it was silly, that it was just the thrill of something new. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The next time they met, her heart betrayed her. He reached for a bag of oranges on the top shelf, and his hand brushed hers as he handed one to her. "Here," he said, smiling as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Her breath caught for a second, her heart racing at the simplest touch. It was then, standing in the fluorescent glow of the produce section, that Margaret felt the truth settle over her like a gentle storm. She was falling for him. It was absurd, illogical, and impossible. Yet, there it was, undeniable and unrelenting. Her heart, after years of dormancy, was waking up, and it terrified her. Margaret spent the next week avoiding the grocery store. She told herself it was because she didn't need anything, but the truth gnawed at her in quiet moments. She was running. Running from the warmth in her chest, the irrational hope that had begun to blossom, and the chaos of emotions she couldn't untangle. At night, she replayed their conversations, his easy laugh, and the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about the small joys in life. Then came the doubts, loud and relentless. What would people think? A woman in her 50s entertaining the idea of a younger man? It was absurd, wasn't it? She sought solace in old routines, reading, gardening, and cleaning the same spotless countertops. Yet, nothing filled the ache that had settled in her heart. For years, she convinced herself that she was content, that life was as it should be. But now, every moment without Eric felt like a muted existence, as if the world had lost some of its color. One evening, while tidying her kitchen, Margaret glanced at her reflection in the darkened window. The lines around her eyes, the gray streaks in her hair, she saw them all, and her inner critic roared to life. "What are you thinking?" she whispered to herself, shaking her head. "You're not young anymore. You're not enough." But then another voice, softer yet persistent, emerged. It reminded her of how Eric looked at her, as though she mattered. It spoke of the ease she felt in his presence, and the joy he brought to her otherwise monotonous days. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret sat by the window and watched the moonlight filter through the trees. She let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to let go of her fears, to let herself care for someone without overthinking the consequences. She thought of her late husband, who had always encouraged her to live fully, to take chances. Would he want her to bury herself in solitude forever? Or would he want her to embrace the possibility of something new, no matter how unconventional? The idea of stepping into uncharted territory was terrifying, but so was the thought of letting this connection fade into nothingness. For the first time in years, Margaret felt as though her heart had woken up, and she wasn't sure she could silence it. She didn't have the answers, but one thing became clear as dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight kissed the horizon. She couldn't keep running. If she wanted to make sense of her feelings, she had to face them, no matter how messy or complicated it might get. And that meant seeing Eric again. The decision wasn't made in a grand, cinematic moment. It came in the middle of an ordinary day, as Margaret stood in her living room, staring at a stack of unopened books on her coffee table. She couldn't concentrate on her usual distractions. The thought of Eric, his easy smile, his kind eyes, lingered like a melody she couldn't shake. She realized that her avoidance hadn't dulled her feelings. It had only made them sharper. Her fingers hovered over her phone, the blank screen reflecting her uncertainty. She hadn't saved his number, though she didn't need to, as the digits were etched into her memory. Her heart pounded as she tapped out a message. "Hi, Eric. I was wondering if you might like to come by for a cup of tea sometime. I've got a new blend I think you'd enjoy." She read it over a dozen times, scrutinizing every word. Was it too forward? Too casual? Her thumb trembled over the send button before she finally pressed it, releasing the message into the unknown. Seconds felt like hours as she waited for a response. What if he didn't reply? What if he misread her intention? Just as her anxiety peaked, her phone buzzed. "That sounds great, Margaret." How about tomorrow afternoon? Her breath caught. Tomorrow. It was suddenly real. She spent the next day in a flurry of preparations, cleaning the house even though it was already spotless, arranging flowers in a vase, and baking scones despite her limited skills in the kitchen. The anticipation was exhilarating and nerve-wracking all at once. When the clock struck 3 o'clock, Margaret was in her favorite chair, fidgeting with a napkin. She heard his knock, a soft but certain sound, and her heart leaped. She opened the door to find Eric standing there, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "I thought these might brighten your day," he said with a grin. "They already have," she replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her chest. He stepped inside, and the room seemed to warm instantly. They settled at the table, sipping tea and nibbling on the slightly misshapen scones. Conversation flowed as it always did, effortless and comforting. But beneath the surface of their words, Margaret felt something more, a connection that had deepened, an energy that hummed in the spaces between their laughter and silence. As he complimented her tea and shared a story about a hike he'd been on recently, Margaret realized how easy it was to feel at home with him. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to think, maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as impossible as she'd feared. Eric's visit was no longer just a casual afternoon tea. As they sat in her living room, the world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet hum of the room they shared. Margaret watched him, his expression so open and genuine, his laughter ringing like a song she hadn't known she was missing. For the first time in ages, she felt seen, not just as a woman of a certain age, but as someone worth knowing, worth loving. And though the age gap between them was still present in her mind, it no longer seemed as significant as it once did. They were simply two people enjoying each other's company, their connection becoming something deeper with every passing moment. As they spoke about their lives, their passions, and the things they'd each experienced, the air between them shifted. The intimacy that had always been there, subtly beneath the surface, grew more pronounced. Every glance felt like an invitation. Every brush of their hands when passing the teapot felt like a spark that could ignite into something more. And then it happened. Eric, with his thoughtful, unhurried way of listening, leaned closer, his voice softer now. "I like being here with you, Margaret. More than I expected," he said, his gaze meeting hers, and for a moment, time seemed to still. Margaret's heart raced. She could feel the pull of him, the way her body responded to his presence in a way she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. There was no pretending anymore, no hiding behind the walls she had built for so long. In this moment, she was simply a woman, sitting across from a man who made her feel alive again. Before she could speak, Eric gently placed his hand over hers, his touch warm and comforting. "I know we haven't known each other for long," he murmured, his voice low, "but I think there's something here." The words hung in the air, and Margaret's breath caught in her chest. She had known, of course, but hearing him say it out loud, hearing him affirm what she'd been too afraid to admit to herself, left her both elated and terrified. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, questions, doubts. Could this really be happening? Was it foolish to let herself feel this way? But all of that melted away the moment Eric gently squeezed her hand, his touch grounding her. She let out a shaky breath and found herself smiling, a real smile, not one born out of politeness or necessity, but one born from something more. "I think so too," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but full of conviction. And in that quiet, simple admission, something shifted between them. The world outside continued its march, but inside her home, inside the bubble they had created together, everything felt suspended in that one perfect moment of connection. As the evening wore on and the conversation became more intimate, Margaret realized that this was what she had been waiting for. Not just the excitement of newfound affection, but the recognition that she was worthy of love, that age had not diminished her ability to feel deeply or to desire. In the warmth of his presence, she felt herself shedding layers of doubt, embracing something she had long since denied herself, the possibility of love, real love, at any stage of life. As the evening settled into a comfortable quiet, Margaret found herself staring into her teacup, watching the steam rise in delicate curls. Eric had left some time ago, but his presence lingered in her home like the scent of the flowers he'd brought with him. The faintest smile curved her lips as she reflected on the evening. She had spent so many years hiding parts of herself, believing that the world had no room for a woman her age to experience the things she'd longed for. The thrill of new love, the rush of affection, the simple joy of being seen. There was a part of her, too, that had buried these desires out of a quiet shame, as if her years should have made her immune to such feelings. And yet here she was, realizing how deeply she had been wrong. Eric had changed everything. He had shown her that love wasn't bound by age, by the conventions of time or societal expectations. It was bound only by the hearts that dared to feel it, to embrace it. His words had echoed in her mind throughout the evening. "I like being here with you, Margaret. More than I expected." And now she understood what he meant. There was no calculation, no attempt to measure the past against the present. There was only a connection between two people, as raw and real as any she'd ever known. Her reflection was interrupted by a soft chuckle escaping her lips. It was ironic, wasn't it? The older she got, the more she understood that the constructs we impose on ourselves about what love should look like, when it should happen, and who it should happen with, are often the very things that hold us back from truly living. Margaret thought of all the women she'd known over the years, friends, acquaintances, even family, who, like her, had quietly accepted the notion that romantic love was something of the past, something that belonged to the young, to those with fewer lines etched into their faces, fewer regrets stored in their hearts. How wrong they all were! Love was not something to be left behind. It was something to be embraced, even if it meant crossing boundaries and stepping out of one's comfort zone. What had she feared, really? The judgment of others? The whispers of people who didn't know what it felt like to burn with desire at any age? Or was it simply the vulnerability of opening herself up again? Margaret understood, more than ever, that age was not the enemy of love. Fear was. Fear of the unknown, of rejection, of losing the comfort of her own solitude. But tonight, she had learned that there was strength in embracing uncertainty. That when love comes knocking, it doesn't matter when or where, but whether you're willing to answer the door. She walked over to the window, gazing out at the moonlight casting shadows across the garden. The world was still, but her heart beat louder, stronger than it had in years. She no longer feared the passage of time. Instead, she welcomed it. The past had shaped her, yes, but the future, well, that was still unwritten. And with Eric, it was no longer a future of loneliness or quiet resignation. It was one filled with possibility. A soft sigh left her lips, her eyes glistening with something new, hope. Perhaps it wasn't too late after all. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting a soft golden light across the table where Margaret sat, sipping her coffee. It had been a few days since Eric's visit, but the warmth of his presence still lingered in her home and in her heart. She found herself smiling more, even during the most ordinary moments of her day. The sound of birds singing outside her window, the feel of her favorite sweater against her skin. It all felt different now, as if the world had gently shifted, making room for something unexpected and beautiful. Margaret had never considered herself someone who would have a love story like this. She had always been the sensible one, the one who took comfort in the predictability of her life. Yet here she was, standing at the threshold of a new chapter, one that defied all the rules she had once believed in. The reality of her connection with Eric was undeniable, and it had taught her something invaluable. Love does not have an expiration date. It does not come with a set of instructions or a timeline that must be followed. It simply happens in its own time, in its own way. The world around her still had its judgments, its conventions about what was acceptable or proper. But Margaret no longer cared about that. What mattered was how she felt. How she felt when Eric looked at her with that soft, sincere gaze that made her feel seen, not for her age, but for who she truly was. She had spent so many years trying to live up to expectations that she had nearly forgotten how to live for herself. But now, she was remembering. Slowly but surely, she was learning to embrace the love she deserved, regardless of what anyone else thought. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to truly feel the weight of her newfound understanding. Love was not about age, about how many years had passed or how many wrinkles had formed. It was about connection, about two souls coming together, recognizing each other in a way that was deeper than time. And as long as she continued to follow her heart, Margaret knew she would never regret it. She set her cup down, feeling more peaceful than she had in years. The future was hers to shape, and for the first time in a long while, she was no longer afraid to dream. Love, she realized, was not something to wait for. It was something to be lived, fully, openly, and without hesitation. She smiled to herself, thinking of Eric, knowing that whatever came next, it would be worth it. There was no reason to fear what the world might say or think. What mattered now was that she had learned the most important lesson of all. Love had no rules, no boundaries, and no age. It was as boundless as the horizon, and it was hers to claim. Margaret stood up, feeling lighter, freer. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was no longer walking it alone. She was walking it with her heart wide open, ready for whatever love might bring.